today with questions unanswered, please come and speak to one of us. Michael is never in a hurry. He will hang around and talk with you about anything you have questions about for as long as you need. We don't promise to have all the answers, but we do promise to be able to listen and answer with everything we can. And then there are a couple of announcements, the first one of which is this coming Saturday will be the Women's Conference at Oak Knoll. If you need additional information, please see Linda. And then the following Saturday, the 25th, we will be doing the door-to-door, the door knocking or track passing on Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. We will meet in the parking lot of the school right across the street. And then lastly, we're having some challenge with the wind and the doors on this building. The doors get slammed open against a surface where there's a small contact with the glass and the glass breaks. So we're going to work on that and try to get it fixed so it's not a challenge. In the meantime, please watch your children that they don't slam out the doors or that the doors don't open without holding on to it against the wind. We already lost the glass in the back door, and so please watch it in this windy season with the doors and the wind. Is there anything else? Yes? The women's Bible study on Tuesday nights. You should see Kelly, is that right? About it. If you have any questions, check Mattermost. Try to keep everything updated on Mattermost. Then without further ado, please stand with me and give your undivided attention to the reading of the Word of God.
Well, good morning. I'll be reading from the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. And it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And they took them wives of the women of the Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them. And the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord visited his people in the giving of them bread. Wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went unto the way, returned unto the land of Judah. And Naomi said unto her daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as ye have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that ye may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and wept. And they said unto her, Surely, will return with me thee unto thy people? And Naomi said, Turn again, my daughters. Why will ye go with me? Are there yet any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say, I have hope, if I should have a husband also tonight, and should also bear sons, would ye tarry for them till they were grown? Would ye stay for them, having husbands? Nay, my daughters, go, for it grieveth me much for your sake, that the hand of the Lord is gone out of against me. And they lifted up their voice and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her, and she said, Behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back unto her people and unto her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. And Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from the following after thee. For it whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. This is a wonderful word of God.
Okay, so we are in the book of Ruth. We've been going through one book every Sunday and just looking at a summary of what the book is about and how it fits into the biblical story. The Bible is really one single story. And this often gets lost because the books were written over a long period of time, talking about over 1,000 years, written by a lot of different authors, close to 40, give or take, and across a great deal of land and space. And so it would seem, as we read them, it's easy to get involved in the individual stories that the Bible's telling and lose sight that there is one key central story being told. It's not the story that we often as evangelicals think it is. It's not the story of your salvation, even though it does include that. It's not less than that, but it's much more than that. The story of the Bible is a story of God and his creation and how he is restoring it to what he intended it to be. And that includes you, it includes your children, it includes individuals, but it's much, much more than that. And so as we go through these, we're trying to put these books into their broader context and look at them in that way. Now, Ruth is a great book. It's basically, if you like the Hallmark Channel, well, it's basically the Hallmark Channel is the book of Ruth, like on endless loop, right? That's basically what Ruth is. It's just this amazing love story. In fact, it's several love stories, right? You have Ruth and her mother-in-law and their very special relationship. You have Ruth and Boaz and that romantic love story. You have Ruth's love story with the whole Jewish culture that she refuses to abandon. She refuses to leave. And so there's a number of these type of love stories going on in the book of Ruth. And in that way, Ruth is unique in many ways, actually. Ruth is unique in that in the same way the Bible is pretty unique. I'm always amazed by criticisms of the Bible. Look, I read them, I study them, I'm interested in them. I generally find the people that criticize the Bible have not read it in any meaningful way. They haven't given it any due consideration. I'm not saying none of them do. I'm sure there are some. But many of them are simply going with a knee-jerk reaction, a lot of bias, a lot of misinformation. Even if they've read the whole Bible, as some of them like to purport themselves to have done, I don't doubt that their eyes have gone over the words. But there's a big difference between reading it and actually reading it and trying to say, okay, in its own context, what is it saying? Most people that criticize the Bible are pretty ignorant of just how unique it is. The Bible is unlike any other quote-unquote religious text in that it's not a religious text. Just, seems kind of ironic or even oxymoronic, but it really is not let's say by the majority of it, is not what you would think of as religious. For instance, the book of Ruth, great example. The book of Ruth, even though all the characters talk often about God, generally it's in negative terms, and the narrator never does. So the narrator never comes out and says, well, all of this was to give us an example of this of redemption or give us an example of God's providence and provision. None of that. The narrator makes no theological statements whatsoever. It just tells the story of a young Moabite woman who leaves her land to stick with her mother-in-law after they suffered great tragedy in their family, and how she ends up marrying Boaz, and how Boaz eventually, we come to find out, is the great-grandfather of the one who will be King David. And that's basically the story. And there's no like overt statement or any statement whatsoever by the narrator that somehow this was orchestrated by God, that the gods had anything to do with this. This is about famine. This is about common death. This is about loss and widowhood. And it's about redemption. And it's about laws and all the... It has a whole section on the Jewish laws, on how Boaz finagles and kind of works his way around some of the technicalities in the legal system in order that he could be the one to marry Ruth. I mean, none of this screams out, right, miracle or mysticism or religious. Now, we should not be, as Christians, we should not be shy or ashamed of the miracles the Bible does relate. However, the Bible relates far fewer miracles, relatively speaking, than the nightly news does. In fact, I just read a report from the Cornyn Center. They basically review journalism and track it, and they have a whole article complaining that the nightly news talks way too much about miracles than they should. And you can read pages and pages and pages in the Bible and find nothing about miracles. Now, there are some. They're relatively few. The Bible is a different type of a book, very, very unique. And that it be taken so seriously for so long by so many people across so many cultures should tell you and tell me that we should be a little more cautious in our criticisms, a bit more cautious, because it's not the book we often think it is. It's a very unique book. So Ruth is a great example of just how unique the Bible is and the kind of stories it's telling and the kind of ways that we see God operating through history. If you read any of the other religious texts, right, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, or you read any of the other ancient texts that supposedly the Bible is emulating or is somehow copying or riffing on, if you read these texts, it's all about how the gods are elbow deep in man's issues and in man's events. They're just right up to their elbows in the way the world is working, and they're doing all this stuff. And when you read the Bible, that is not generally the story you're told. God intervenes occasionally in the biblical history, not often, relatively speaking. So that makes it very unique. Now, that's neither good nor bad. That's not to say that it would be bad for God to intervene. It's just not the way the biblical story is told. And so we should take the Bible as it comes to us. We should accept it as it says. We shouldn't make more miracles than there are, and we shouldn't be ashamed of the ones it tells us. But Ruth is a very good example of how we are given a very human story. And behind that story, if you're a person of faith, it's very clear that God's providence is at work all through the book of Ruth. Just like when we get to Esther, we'll see the same thing. Esther's is even less. Nobody mentions God in the book of Esther, and yet there it is in the Bible. Very interesting set of books. As I said, Ruth is a love story. It's not just a unique story, it's a love story. It's several love stories. It has this classic romance story. Great, great story of romance between Ruth and Boaz. And if you're wanting to read a real wholesome and interesting love story, the one that takes place here is good. And it's also very realistic. It's not fictional or far-fetched. It's a very interesting love story. And it's got a great, even greater story of Ruth and Naomi's relationship and how that relationship worked out. But like I said, the deepest love story in the book of Ruth is Ruth's appreciation for Jewish culture. She had come into contact with Naomi and her husband and Naomi's son, who was Ruth's husband, and apparently had become very much enraptured by their culture, by their God, by their land, by the whole story that they had. And she insists on going back to Israel when Naomi decides to leave Moab because everything has fallen apart on her. She suffered tremendous tragedy. And so Ruth insists to go back with her to Israel. The other daughter-in-law wants to, in the end, is overcome by grief and is not able to. For those of you that want a pop culture reference, Oprah Winfrey says that she was actually named after the other sister. Her mom just didn't know how to spell. And she was supposed to have been Orpah Winfrey and turned out to be Oprah Winfrey. So that's how Ruth affects your everyday life, apparently. Those of you that are into Oprah, there you go. Now you have a connection to the Bible, so when you read the book of Ruth, you'll be very interested, right? Okay. Ruth is a lot more than just those things, though. I want you to remember what we talked about, it was 3 or 4 weeks ago now, when we looked at Judges. And we talked about how Judges is the darkest book in the Bible. And there's really no competition. It really is a very dark and disturbing book. The book of Ruth transpires, the events that it records happen about 2/3 of the way through the book of Judges. And in the exact, or basically the exact, not the exact, in the same general vicinity that the worst events of Judges happen in. So if you remember, we looked at Judges, and the concubine, and how she's raped, and all the terrible things that happen at the end of the book of Judges. All of that happens between the tribe of between the northern side of Benjamin to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is like right in the middle of the tribe of Benjamin, if you're trying to put it on a map. So you got the tribe of Benjamin, which is basically like a state, like the state of Texas, not nearly that big, but pretty small. But anyways, it's a province. And right in the middle of that is what turned into, later on under King David, the city of Jerusalem. Right? Well, all of that of Judges happens right in that area, around Jerusalem and going towards Bethlehem. So Bethlehem is in the south of Jerusalem, and Judges takes place. And it's about a 10-mile section. So Judges, all of that horrible stuff takes place in about a 10-mile radius. Well, guess where the book of Ruth takes place? In the same 10-mile radius, at roughly the same period of time. And yet, we are talking about two entirely different tones between these two books. Judges is dark and bleak and horrible. And there is human tragedy in Ruth. It happens in Moab. But where they're at, and their life and their city, their community, you wouldn't even think that it's taking place anywhere near the book of Judges, much less smack in the middle of it. And so this Ruth is just this, as dark as Judges describes that area of Israel and those people, Ruth describes an entirely alternate reality, entirely different existence. It is truly a story of a light in a very dark place. And if you read Ruth, and that's all we had of the time of the Judges, we would conclude that the period of the Judges must have been this very wonderful, nostalgic, very beautiful, idyllic type of existence. Because you read Ruth, and while people are dying, and there is some tragedy, everybody is kind and considerate and virtuous and honest and transparent. None of the horrible things that we find in Judges happen in the book of Ruth at all. And so it's a very interesting story of being a light in the midst of a very, very dark place. And they don't make a lot of it. The book of Ruth, it's just there, and you're just left as the reader to put the pieces together and realize, hey, Ruth is telling a story that's very out of step with its time. These people are not living the same life that everybody around them is living. They're living a very unique, a very special life, and getting very different results from it, all at the same time. And so it's a good balance to the book of Judges. If all we had were the book of Judges, well, we would just assume that everything was horribly black and bleak, and there's nothing good in it. And it's, you know, in that way we can kind of identify with it, because that's how you and I look at the news, read it on the internet anyways, right? If you go to one news site, everything's terrible, the whole country's falling apart, all the politicians are liars, cheats, and thieves, right? Everything's dark and black, and the world's ending, and you just have this pessimistic view. And you think, well, there's just nothing good in the world anymore. We're just going to hell in a handbasket. But the book of Ruth tells us that in the midst of all darkness, there's always light. And this is not a unique or unusual teaching in the Bible. It actually makes this case throughout. It makes it, for instance, to Elijah, that he thought he was the only one left, that all the Israel had forsaken, and there was nothing good left, and he was the only one left, and he was going to die, and that was it. God's name and God's word and God's will would be extinguished. And God told him, no, I've reserved 7,000 prophets. You're not the only one. And it may seem like the world around you is very dark and very bleak. The book of Ruth tells us a story that God always has a light in the darkness. And that light can be really, really bright and really good. And when you read the book of Ruth, you find an incredible story. We'll talk about that more in a minute. There's another story that's told in the book of Ruth. And that's the story of a God who never forsakes, never moves on, and never gives up. It's what Paul refers to in Romans as God's righteousness. We typically, and I mean Protestant evangelicals, we typically misunderstand that phrase that Paul uses, because he says in Romans chapter 1, verse 17, he says that in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. And as evangelicals, we tend to shy away from the righteousness of God. We don't really like to talk about it a lot. We prefer grace and mercy, because we think, well, righteousness is harsh and demanding and unattainable. So we don't want God's righteousness in that sense. We don't want it applied to us. We don't want to be judged by his righteousness, and that's what we think Paul is often talking about. It's not what he's talking about. Paul is speaking in the context of Old Testament prophecy. The righteousness of God in the Old Testament is not judgment. It's not harsh. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Over and over through the Old Testament, God's righteousness, that term, is synonymous with his grace and his mercy. It's not the righteousness that God demands from sinners that he's talking about. It's the righteousness of God himself, that he's living up to his word, that he's fulfilling his purpose, that he's not giving up on what he started, that he's not walking away from everything and saying, you know what, you're too evil, or it's too hard, or it's a lost cause, and we're just gonna throw away everything, and maybe we'll just start all over and try this anew. It's what we find Moses depending on. So Moses depends on this greatly. In fact, Moses was the first one to make this argument. And others after Moses, they repeated the argument, not I don't think quite as brilliantly, because it's never quite as brilliant when you're not the one who came up with the idea. But Moses, he's the first one that uses this. So if you remember in the book of Exodus, he actually does it twice. First time is in the book of Exodus. The children of Israel have sinned grievously. And so God tells Moses, I'm just going to destroy them. I'm just going to wipe all of them out, and we're just going to take you and your family, and we're going to turn you into my new nation. Now, most of us would be like, we would jump on that. That sounds like a great offer, right? You get to be king, and then Moses is thinking, that's wonderful. Moses comes back and says, you could do that. But if you do that, what is everyone going to say about you? They're going to say that you went to all that work to get them out of Egypt. You went to all that trouble to get them across the Red Sea and bury the Egyptians and redeem them. And you got them out in the desert, and a year later you couldn't handle it anymore. And you gave up. And God says, you're right. The argument that Moses is making is God's righteousness. That God is righteous within himself. That he will fulfill what his purpose has been to do because he's bound by his own inherent goodness, or rightness, or trueness, straightness. That's the argument of Moses. Like I said, many people use it again. David uses it after he sins. It's not nearly as compelling, because when you use it for yourself, it's kind of, it's just not quite as good. When David says in Psalm 51, David tells God, forgive me, pardon me, cleanse me. Why? And Paul quotes this in Romans. What's his argument to be forgiven? You got to have an argument. You can't just say forgive me. At least it doesn't seem that way. And so what is David's argument? He says, so that you will be justified when you're judged. So that when people say, what did you do with David? You are justified. You come out righteous. You fulfilled. You didn't abandon your purpose and your project. That's David's argument. Same thing. Like I said, it's about himself, so there's always that caveat. This is a story that Ruth tells. It continues to tell. This is the story of the Bible. According to Paul in Romans, the story of the whole Bible is that God is not abandoning what he started. Paul summarizes it in one of the most perfect ways of doing it. There's probably no better summary of God's righteousness than what we find in Philippians, where Paul says, he that began the good work in you will perfect it. That's what God's righteousness is about. That what God started because of himself, not because of you, not because of who you are or who you aren't, but because of his own inner straightness, his own inner correctness, his own inner, what Paul calls his own inner righteousness. That God will conclude what he started. It's why he hasn't abandoned creation. It's why he's going to remake it. He's not going to get rid of it and make entirely new ones, like some people think, but he is going to reimagine it. He's going to reform it. In fact, what we're told is he's going to resurrect it. He's going to bring it back from the dead the same way and by the same power and in the same continuing operation that he brought Jesus back from the dead. Not like he brought Jesus back from the dead, but it'll actually be the same operation of power by which he raised Jesus from the dead. Is like a little snowball that has come down the mountain and turned into a massive avalanche. He is going to transform all of creation, heaven and earth, not just the physical creation. A lot of times we hear creation, we think it's only material. It's not. Creation is everything outside of God. Everything that's not God is creation. And he's going to completely resurrect, transform, and renew it all. In such a way that the prophets say a couple times, fantastic phrase. They say that this restored, resurrected creation, he says it'll be, God's presence will be so prevalent, so pervasive, that they say it'll be like the waters covering the sea. It'll just be everywhere. Another prophet says it'll be such a situation that nobody is going to say, no God, because everybody will know him. Because his presence will be everywhere, all at once. Ruth contributes to that story. It contributes to the idea that God is not abandoning anything or anyone. And Naomi's family has gone off to Moab, certainly forgotten by many people. I mean, who's going to notice, 5 or 6 people moving away? I mean, people have moved out of your life. You're probably fine with it. You miss them for a little while, but your life goes on. Everybody's life went on. And you would think, well, they're in Moab and tragedy befell them. She blames God for it, or at least credits God, maybe be a better way of saying it. She credits God for the loss. Thinks probably that it's partially her fault. They shouldn't have gone to Moab. They should have just had faith. They should have been like all their neighbors and all their family members who stuck it out. And now she finds out in Israel that the famine's over. God is again blessing Bethlehem, again blessing their city, and her life has turned to complete tragedy. But the book of Ruth is that even when Ruth has nothing good to say about God, Naomi, sorry. Even when Naomi has nothing good to say about God, and she never does, very lightly maybe, once her grandson is born, she has one little statement that could be interpreted somewhat positive, but really nothing. The overall story of Ruth is God is still faithful. It's like what Paul wrote in 2 Timothy. If we are unfaithful, he remains faithful. And Ruth is the story not of faithful Naomi, or even faithful Ruth, or Boaz. And they are quite exemplary. The book of Ruth is a story about a faithful God who does not abandon his purposes and his people. And in that, it's a great story. So God never forsakes, never moves on, and never gives up. The book of Ruth is about something else also. The book of Ruth is about what could happen if regular, authentic human beings, I want to emphasize that, authentic human beings, just live up to their own humanness. Now, I know that sounds kind of odd to some people because we should be talking about spirituality and exceeding humanity. The problem isn't that you and I are too human. The problem is we're not human enough. Sin dehumanizes us. It doesn't make us more human, it makes us less than human. The story of Jesus is that he came as the true human being, both God and man, but as man, he is the true human being, living up to every bit of what it meant to be created in the image and likeness of God. That's what it is to be human. To be human is not to be sinful. That's less than human. To be human is to be God's image and his likeness. And Jesus comes as the perfect image and the perfect likeness of God. What we have in Book of Ruth, and again, remember the context. They're in the middle of one of the darkest, most evil chapters in all of Jewish history. One of the absolute worst. And in the middle, and they're not just like on the periphery, out on the East Coast or the West Coast or up in the North or in the South, far away, down in some type of a Bible belt. They are right in the middle of all the darkness that happens in Judges. They're right in the middle of it. And in the middle of that, they have carved out a place that is kind and loving and honest and transparent. You go read how those people acted in the last 4 or 5 chapters of Judges. Sending out their daughters and their wives to be raped so they don't have to face it themselves, cutting up the dead bodies and mailing them around, capturing cities just so they can take their wives from them, and killing all the men and children so they can steal all the women. It's just what they're doing, trying to pursue their own interests, is just horrible in the book of Judges. And when we get to Ruth, it's an entirely different story. There's nobody acting without virtue. Nobody. Everybody is going about business. They're trying to build businesses. They're trying to build wealth. They're trying to build families. They're trying to build inheritance. They are going about the everyday life just like everybody would, but they are doing it without trampling over anyone else to accomplish it. For example, Ruth goes out to glean. Boaz has, in fact, this is the only time we find it actually implemented practically, the laws of the gleaning. There are many commentaries and many scholars who will say that it doesn't appear that Israel ever actually implemented these laws for the poor. They might have, but we don't have a great deal of evidence that they've actually ever done this. There doesn't seem to be much evidence that there ever was an actual jubilee. They were supposed to be doing it every 50 years. There's not a lot of evidence they ever did it at all. That people just languished in debt for generations because they never actually could do it. It's like the founding fathers of America who had every intention of getting rid of slavery, and yet it just they never could turn that corner. And it's how Israel seems to have been. And yet right here in Ruth, all of this is taking place. The kinsman redeemer scenario, the pardon of debt, the gleaning laws, all of these things are all in force in this place. And what a difference it makes in the outcome of this story. Opposed to the book of Judges where everybody is out for themselves. How does Judges summarize what's going on? There was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That's Judges. In the book of Ruth, everybody is acting virtuously. They're pursuing their own interests, but within the boundaries of morality and ethics. And it's all the difference in the world between the two stories. You and I live in a very dark place too sometimes. Not like Judges. They're not hacking up concubines in the street yet, so, it's not that bad. But it's not great many times. And it's very tempting for us as Christians to think that if you live in that kind of place, you're only going to be able to get ahead if you act like them, if you behave like that. If you have to fit in, you have to get along to go along. And the book of Ruth is telling a different story. It's saying, no, you don't have to do that. You are not required, it is not necessary for you to lower your standards, for you to bend your honesty and your morality. You don't have to lie to your customers to make a good living. Sometimes the world we live in tells you, unless you're willing to bend the rules, unless you're willing to tell some lies, unless you're willing to be a little dishonest, unless you're willing to play the game, you can't get ahead, and they're lying to us. It's not true. It's just not true. You and I have been called into a community of light, into a community of honesty and love and care for others. And no matter what they tell you, and they tell me, no matter what they tell us at our job and in business, you don't have to play their game. Because these people didn't. And they had a great deal more moral pressure on them than you and I do. And they just did not comply. They resisted. So Boaz, he really likes Ruth. She's proposed to him, which is, you would think in those days it didn't happen, but she actually goes and proposes to Boaz. Good application. You young ladies, if he's shy, God says it's okay. Just, plant your flag and say, marry me. Great, great story. Some mothers are saying, no, don't do that. Right, she's proposed to him. He likes her a lot. But there's this technicality. He's not the actual kinsman redeemer. There's somebody who, and they don't name him, but there's somebody who is a little closer relation to her, who is the one who technically is supposed to do it. And so within all the confines of the law and without using any type of lying or cheating, Boaz goes before the judges and says, hey, Naomi has this land that needs to be redeemed. Well, that guy says, great, I could always use more land. And Naomi's a widow. She doesn't have any sons. And so when she dies, I won't have to give that land up to anybody. I'll be able to keep it in my family. I'll actually increase my holdings. Because the Jewish law was, and this will get a little bit in the weeds, but it'll be very quick, so don't glaze over on me. The Jewish law was everybody kept their land eventually, right? God did not want one big landholder to just suck up all the land and the entire population become serfs. He had given the land to each family, and they were supposed to keep it. So at the end of certain periods of time and certain events, all the land got redistributed back to its original owners, unless they're all dead. So he's thinking, well, she's the end of the line, so I can redeem the land, and it'll stay in my inheritance. That's wonderful. It's a win-win. Okay, I'll do the redemption. And then Boaz says, oh, but I forgot to mention, she has a daughter-in-law. So you're going to obviously have to marry the daughter-in-law and resuscitate children for the husband that died, because that's the law of redemption. And he's like, oh no, not only will all that land go back to them, but now I've brought in other children into my family, and I'm going to have to divide he says it's going to eat up I'm not going to increase my holdings, I'm actually going to lose. And he goes, oh, I don't think I want to do that. But they're all very honest with each other. They're all very forthright. They have ambitions. They have certain goals and desires. They're trying to increase their holdings. They're doing business. They're not just giving everything away, living in a hippie la-la land. They're living in the real world, but they're doing it honestly and straightforwardly. And they're doing it according to how God had told them to do things. And he says, no, I don't think I can do that. And Boaz says, well, I'll do it. And he does. I'll redeem the land. I'll redeem the wife. And that's how Boaz and Ruth, like they say, hook up. That's how they get together. That's how they get married. And it's great. It's a great story. Yeah, you know what? It's not all romances are like they show in the Hallmark. Sometimes there's some T's to cross and some I's you have to dot to make things work. But they make it work. And they do it without sacrificing their virtue. And the story just goes on like that. We could go through the whole book. It's a great book, but you read it. Go home today. It's 4 chapters. You can read it in about 15 minutes. Read through the book of Ruth at least once this week. And notice how all the characters in the book of Ruth, all of them, behave honorably and righteously and justly and honestly with each other. And what is the result of that? It's the type of community that you and I would love to live in. So let me ask you this. What type of community are you and I building? You cannot continue to blame society for all the darkness, because you were called to be light. And you and I can live in community with each other and with those around us in love and in honesty and transparency, and we can create some light in the middle of darkness. Because if they could do it in much bleaker times, then you and I certainly can. So are we doing that? How are we living? Now there's one more story, and I'm going to end with this. The book of Ruth tells one other interesting story, and that's the story of redemption. It's the story of redemption. It's how the land was redeemed, Ruth was redeemed, Naomi's life was redeemed. Look, they suffered tragedy. They suffered consequences of decisions. Some of them probably weren't great decisions. Some of them might have been good decisions at the time, but everything has consequences. They suffered a great deal of tragedy, but they experienced a tremendous amount of redemption. And in the end, we find Naomi not happier than she was, but certainly not sadder. She has a new grandchild. She's part of a new family. And it tells us that all of this has been happening in God's providence, essentially, setting up the coming of King David. Long before Saul was even king, God is redeeming Israel. He's already redeeming Israel out of the darkness that hasn't even happened yet. The whole end of Judges hasn't happened yet, but God is already putting into effect a means by which not only the redemption of Israel would take place, and not only your own personal redemption took place, but the redemption of his entire creation project. The whole thing is being, again, put into effect right here. And we see in the book of Ruth clear presages of the coming of Jesus. Him stepping in, not by force, but voluntarily, as the kinsman redeemer, redeeming everything. Making everything right again. Making everything whole again. At great cost to himself, but great benefit to everyone. Tremendous story of the book of Ruth. So, read it again. Look at the passage that Timothy read. Tremendous declaration of faith that Ruth says, your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you go, I'll go. Where you die, I'll die. If you don't know what it means to have faith, a lot of people nowadays don't know what that means. What does it mean to have faith? It really means just that. For you to tell Jesus, I'm with you. No matter what. I'm with you. That's faith. Ruth had a tremendous declaration of faith, experienced a tremendous redemption. It's a great story. I hope you'll read it. Let's close with prayer. Father in heaven, we're very grateful and thankful for your word. We ask that as we read this small, beautiful book, that it would make a lasting and meaningful impression on how we live our lives, that we would see in it an example of people who resisted darkness and evil in their day, that stood up in very small personal ways, stood up for righteousness and became lights in a very dark place and set upon a path that eventually led both to King David, his descendants, and ultimately the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. We thank you for this example, for this illustration, and we ask that we would live up to it in the name of Jesus. We ask all things. Thank you for being here, and we will see you again next Sunday.